Hello, I'm Stephen Watson, and welcome to this, an edition of A View from the Bridge. We're back in the CTN studio for another fireside chat with leaders in the Royal Navy and Royal Marines. A chance to hear their insights, understand some of their challenges, and to have an update on current operations. The format is simple. We have an hour of conversation, and you, our audience, all members and supporters of the Royal Navy and Royal Marines charity, or members of the Naval Review. I'm going to get the ball rolling in a moment, but then you have a job of work to do. Please be ready to put your questions and do so in the chat function. Last time, we had the Vice Chief of Defence Staff, General Gwyn Jenkins, in the studio chair. And this evening, I'm delighted to welcome Rear Admiral James Parkin, the Royal Navy's Director Develop. And James, you've come, I think, hot foot from the First Sea Lords Conference over at Lancaster House. Is that right?
Absolutely right. 2 days of fascinating conversation and a natural lead in to our conversation tonight, Stephen.
Well, brilliant to have you here. You're very welcome. But before we start, some sad news. I'm sure many watching will be aware that our friend and colleague, Vice Admiral Sir Clive Johnson, died suddenly and unexpectedly on Sunday afternoon. James, you worked and knew Clive well. A huge loss.
An absolutely massive loss, and all the more terrible for it being so unexpected. When I first started work in my first job in the Ministry of Defence, he was Assistant Chief of the Naval Staff, and we were working up towards the Defence Review in 2015. And he recognised a young commander in his first non-frontline job, slightly out of his depth, not understanding the system or the building. And although there were 2 or 3 layers between me and him, he would regularly take me under his wing, explain the system, and make me feel an utterly valued part of his team. And he did that with absolutely everybody, making leadership and management seem as instinctive as breathing. And over the subsequent years, he acted as a real mentor, a friend to me and many, many others. And it's so terrible what happened. And of course, our thoughts are that with Ali and their family.
Indeed. In fact, he was in this very television studio just a week ago, recording some insights into the geopolitical situation. And I think everybody here in the studio team and others who were watching just reflected on how insightful and how on his A game he was even just a week ago. So our thoughts with his family.
Absolutely.
James, the title of this evening's conversation, rather ominously, is in part, how are we going to win possibly the next world war? And what role will the Royal Navy play in winning, if it sadly comes, another conflict? That is very much the work that you are leading as Director Develop. How are we going to do it?
I mean, just a small question, Stephen, to start with, because I don't think it's escaped anyone's attention over the last few years that the world is a much more dangerous, a much more challenging place, but also one where the rules-based system has been challenged in a way it hasn't been since 1945. The Defence Secretary announced, as you know, in his view, we were moving into a pre-war era, and it's hard to disagree with the evidence that got him to that space. I know some of your previous speakers have touched on that as well. My role is to ensure that 2 things are true. One is that war never comes. We are setting up and we have inherited a deterrent force. But the second thing that I am tasked to do, and that of my team, is to ensure that if deterrence fails, and we have to be prepared for it, that what we are able to do is to fight and win. Fighting and winning is not necessarily in the vernacular. It's not a conversation that we've had for many, many decades. And so in aiming for that never to take place, we have to be prepared for what happens when deterrence fails. Yeah. And my job is to ensure that it doesn't.
I mean, the nature of conflict and how we would address that and win, of course, is changing profoundly. And we heard actually at the Sea Power Conference over the last 2 days, a huge amount about the world of AI, cyber, importantly, autonomy. I mean, in your view, I mean, how big and profound a change is that to the way that conflict is undertaken?
I think we've got to be careful of drawing the right lessons from modern conflict. What's happening in the Black Sea and in Ukraine, what's happening in the Red Sea, are just an evolution of conflict that has effectively not changed its character for centuries. But the tools and the techniques and the tactics are always being updated. And just as people who joined the Navy 40, 50 years ago will recognise what a ship looks like and how the sailors in it will operate, equally, people who joined the Navy 2 years ago already feel that the technology has adapted and got faster. An example, perhaps, as you've brought up, is the use of AI. AI itself is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end, and it is the means to understand that you are inside the enemy's OODA loop, that you can react and the systems that you control can react quicker than you can be taken advantage of. Now, there's numerous ways in which that can take place. It can be at the heart of business systems, ensuring you don't need to keep payrolls of clerks. It can be inside sonar systems, taking out that very faint acoustic signature that previously took a 10-year training pipeline to have a human being to do. But equally, it can be in ensuring you pick out from the clutter of terabytes of data the one thing that's going to threaten you and discard everything that isn't. It's a huge topic and one.
But are we really on the cusp of something completely transformational? I mean, you reflect on your career over a number of decades in the Royal Navy. Others, looking back over, even just this, this century or this generation. And there's always been change, but we're on the cusp of something which is almost unrecognisable. I mean, the Prime Minister earlier this week gave a speech where he said there's going to be more change in the next 5 years than there has been in the last 30 combined. I mean, do you see it that way? Is that what we're facing?
I mean, there's a quote on the wall of the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and I think it's Jeff Bezos. I should probably check, but it says, in huge letters on there, people always overestimate the change in the next 5 years and underestimate it in the next 20. And I think the Prime Minister's right. The acceleration of technology and its adoption of technology has been fueled by the realization, particularly in Ukraine, but elsewhere in the world, that the old ways of doing business are no longer fit for purpose. The Ukrainian government has achieved sea denial in the Black Sea, and they haven't got a navy anywhere near there. The way in which the Russian fleet has been held at bay by effectively autonomy, AI enabled, but it's autonomy that's enabled it to do it, is something that we've got to learn from. And one of the reasons why I talk quite a lot about a high-low mix is because there will always be a role for ballistic nuclear missile submarines, for aircraft carriers, for crewed fixed-wing jets in the next 10, 20, 30 years. But that's not it. It's the way in which you team them with loyal wingmen in the air, loyal shipmates at sea, because bigger fleets win wars. And the way in which you build a bigger fleet is not another 30 frigates or another 20 destroyers, much as the sailor in me would love that to be true. It's giving the effect of what those destroyers and frigate equivalents can be. And that's where I think our unique selling point is, because we've got the heart of the future fleet. We've inherited it. It's performing awesomely in the Red Sea, for an example. But we can do more and we can get bigger. And that's how we're going to win the next war.
Well, let's just come back to Ukraine. You talked about the experience in the Black Sea and sea denial without a navy. I mean, for those who aren't watching this day to day, how have the Ukrainians, perhaps with a little bit of outside help, how have they actually done that? And what is at the heart of that technology, those innovations? And what are you and your team in the Royal Navy taking away from that?
I think what we're seeing is effectively initially an extension of what was happening on the land at sea. And perhaps there's three areas which have taken observers by surprise, but if they retrospectively look back, it shouldn't do. One is the electromagnetic spectrum is the contested domain. Nothing happens anymore on the battlefield, at sea, in space, in the air, on the ground, unless you have dominance of the electromagnetic spectrum. The old era of you can hide, but you can still emit is no longer true. if you emit, if you are issuing signals, you can be detected. And if you can be detected, you can be killed. That's probably the biggest lesson that we're learning. So although perhaps there are ways of getting around that, it is an arms race of detection, emission, a sort of stealth, low probability, very low probability of detection and low probability of intercept, because the people who are winning that are the ones with the most up-to-date technology. You take that into then the Black Sea, what's happened is that if you are not able to adapt and change your waveform, change your technology, then you will be found and killed first. And I think the great lesson from some of the activity that's happened in the early months of the war was that software companies in the private sector who are working for friendly forces could adapt their algorithms, their waveforms, their software in hours, just like they can in core businesses. Large monolithic state organizations take weeks to do the same. And the speed of that adaptation is what gives the advantage of a nation that's poorer, smaller, and had far fewer assets, and yet still they push them back.
And a huge role for autonomy in this. I mean, I think we've all been captivated by some of the YouTube videos posted by the Ukrainians of unmanned craft attacking, substantial Russian assets and so forth. I mean, is that very accessible technology, or is that also really at the cutting edge?
Autonomy is a term that's come to mean many things for many people. I think there's two categories in which we can divide it. There's the autonomy which replaces a human being. So, for example, AI-enabled machine learning, which means you have one person to look at 20 sonar screens rather than 20 people looking at 20 sonar screens. That's AI-enabled autonomy because the function of thinking there. The autonomy that you're looking at is probably agentic autonomy, where you're acting as an agent where previously it would have taken a human being to make a decision. There are ethical considerations wrapped into that as to how we should use it. But if you can find an enemy surface vessel or an enemy formation without emitting and sending that signal back to double check, then you've already nullified the advantage the enemy might have in electromagnetic spectrum terms. And that's where it's really important.
Okay. I mean, you've framed it almost as an arms race, and that's probably what is going on. In an arms race, it's important you win it. Where is the UK realistically in this? I mean, we are, despite recent budget promises from the government and undertakings to move, defence spending to 2.5, potentially even more than 2.5 in time. Have we got what it takes to win the sort of arms race you're talking about?
I think the move that has been signposted for a number of years away from counting your military power in terms of platforms, means that the answer is yes. Are we going to build another 30 destroyers? No. Are we going to build another 20 submarines? No, we're not. We cannot afford it. They cost in the billions, and they have an utterly vital role at the heart of our fleet. But there are ways of having them at the centre of a network with vessels that are 100th, 1,000th of the price, which may be disposable, which may only be able to do 20% of what they can do. But that mass that we bring together in that high-low mix of a core, human-controlled, ethically aware decision function, but surrounded by weapons, sensors, airborne, underwater, that's the vision that we're driving towards. The vision the First Sea Lord has given us the green light to aim at. And although the budget increase is really, really welcome, I wouldn't want people to think that it's still somehow suppressing our ambition. AI does not cost the same as a submarine. Uncrewed vessels that go at 40 knots and can defeat electromagnetic jamming are not counted in the tens of millions. We have an opportunity to create a modern fleet that takes the best of the old.
Presumably that's also the case for our adversaries. Actually those that are wish to do us harm or challenge our interests, all of this becomes so much more accessible for those with harm intent.
It does. Which is why you can't rely on offensive capability in itself. But I go back to deterrence. If the enemy is deterred from the consequences of acting, then your ability to strike back and strike back harder is what we're aiming to do in the conventional space, which we've done for almost 6 decades in the nuclear space. The nuclear deterrent is sometimes challenged as what's it ever done for us? We are using that deterrent every single day. Every day we are safe, we are secure. We live in a Western liberal democracy upholding the rules. We've used a nuclear deterrent today, and tomorrow we'll use it again and again. Where we find the threshold of escalation where nuclear deterrence is perhaps not in the enemy's calculus, we've got to find the conventional equivalent. And that's what I think we can do by building mass together in a way that deters the king's enemies from attacking our interests and those of our friends in a way that we would seek to stop.
James, fascinating. Let me just remind everybody that I'm very keen to bring others into the conversation. So now is a good moment to start putting your questions or any insights you'd like to have from James. I mean, the way this will work, I mean, you're not going to appear on the screen, so don't worry. Put your question and say who you are, and it'll come up on an iPad here, and then I can relay that on your behalf. But James, I mean, just coming back to the implications of the transformation that we're talking about, this almost generational change. I mean, for UK forces and structures, I mean, the implications presumably are quite profound. And if we look back at the last few years, I mean, have we been investing in the wrong things? And I appreciate this is heretic talk, but, you know, the aircraft carriers, which have consumed a huge amount of national treasure, which, you know, many commentators say are vulnerable or, you know, difficult to use. And given what you're talking about, 6 billion on aircraft carriers, which doesn't include the operating costs or the aircraft. I mean, you could buy a lot of what you're doing for that sort of money.
I mean, if you think aircraft carriers surrounded by the world's best surface-to-air missile systems are vulnerable, wait until you find out about airfields. You know, where you can look on Google Maps, you can identify from social media posts exactly where they are, what they do, and where every single building is, and are not surrounded with a ring of steel of surface-to-air missiles. Aircraft carriers are surrounded by the world's best defence systems. They are mobile. They have on board a punch that is equivalent to some nations' air forces, and you don't need anyone's permission to move them to where they want to go. If aircraft carriers are yesterday's technology, why is it that every nation on the planet that seeks to be a great power is investing in them? The number of aircraft carriers in build almost is the same as those in service. And although I recognise that it cost a lot of money, it's nowhere near the amount of money of failing to deter, going to war and not having anything to strike back. And the mixture of what we do with fixed-wing aircraft, future uncrewed aircraft, and they're not just one-way effectors. We don't call Tomahawk missiles one-way drones. You know, there are missiles, there are uncrewed aircraft, and an F-35 is the world's best aircraft that's flying at the moment, bar none.
So I'd expect you to give a formidable defence of carrier strike, which you have. But the point is, we still need to invest in high-end platforms.
We do.
As well as the things that you're talking about. And what is going to be the connectivity and the relationship between the two? So if you take, for example, a carrier strike group and you deploy that over the horizon, you know, into areas of danger and conflict, what are the technologies that you're working with that complement that or allow it to do things that a conventional carrier strike capability would not be able to do?
It's an excellent question because, of course, it's an easy accusation to make that it feels very science fiction. And one of the things that we published in 2022 when we wrote the maritime operating concept was trying to unpack that very challenge. How do you link together a uncrewed surface vessel with a radar or an uncrewed air vehicle with a missile with the human beings at the heart of the carrier strike group, the decide function, those who hold that ethical red card? And the answer is with data that is as robust and secure as we can possibly make it. We have a program called StrikeNet. StrikeNet is probably my second most challenging, but equally my most important program because it unlocks the future fleet. And it ensures that a sensor, a weapon, a decider can all connect together in a way that if it were an old-fashioned ship, it would be a cable. And it could be over the horizon, it could be in space, it could not even be British, it could be from allied or partner navies and air forces. And that challenge that we're working so hard to get right is the question of our day. Otherwise, everything I've said in the previous 10 minutes is science fiction and stops on day one when the electromagnetic spectrum's taken over.
Okay. Right, we've got some questions coming in. Let me put some of these to you. First is from Pete Sanderman. Actually, Pete is the man behind Navy Lookout, which provides an amazing commentary. Pete wants to know, he says that the Black Sea demonstrates the need for cheap and very rapidly developed weapons. What is the Royal Navy and importantly industry doing specifically to be ready to fight tonight, and especially in the low-end, uncrewed offensive space?
It's a really good question. I think what we've realised from Ukraine is that the best solution to developing mass, particularly mass that goes bang at the end of it. We like to use euphemisms like kinetic, but effectively things that explode and don't come back, one-way weapons, is to involve companies that can update the data and the artificial intelligence enabled smarts as quick as possible and use the vehicle as cheap as possibly able to be produced. There are 200 UAV companies in Ukraine. Most of them before the war were not UAV companies, they were furniture manufacturers, domestic goods manufacturers. And they've been repurposed for the cheapest possible platform enabled by the most intelligent possible technology. And if you can produce something that can go 200 miles for £10,000, and yes, 1 in 2 of them may not get through, you've created mass very, very quickly. And it goes back to the Mosquito model in World War II, where it was furniture companies that built the Mosquito, because they were the best people placed to churn them out as quickly as possible. We've got industry that could do that, but we're not on a war footing. And quite frankly, we're not actually at war yet. And I wouldn't want people to stop making furniture or fridges because we need to build up a huge stockpile. Because the one thing we have learned about keeping our defence industry going is if you spend too much on stockpile too early, you effectively have the wrong equipment, which you can't upgrade quick enough. And the new model is very different from that. You have an always-on culture, so the stockpiles are big enough to be replenished at the speed of relevance rather than what looks nice in a warehouse for the next 10 years.
I mean, I guess also that the nature of that defence industrial complex needs to change. That, of course, there's a role for the big defence primes, but the sort of things that you are working with require, SMEs, innovators, startup companies. People who traditionally maybe have not been in this domain at all. And I know you don't lead procurement, but our procurement models historically are not very good at embracing those sort of partners, those sort of suppliers. Are we having to reinvent how we make commitments to a small startup on providing something that could be of huge consequence to our defence?
I think we are. And actually, I look at the way in which we've done it in the areas of which I'm responsible, which is effectively the future Navy. We are, I think, getting far better at recognising that the bureaucratic burden that we place on small companies is too high a threshold to reach. If you're a company with 5 to 10 employees and we demand a 600-page questionnaire before you're allowed to bid for a Ministry of Defence contract, you'll just walk away and do something else. There are new organisations, though, set up in the MOD, announced recently the Defence Innovation Agency. We're still shaping what that looks like. There's an organisation called Commercial X, government commercial officers who are empowered by the Treasury to just make decisions instead of having to go through 3, 9, 12 hoops to get approval. We're getting very, very good at that. But of course, we could be better, but the forcing function isn't quite there yet. And our role is to work with some really interesting trade bodies who are becoming much more important to my day-to-day life because they are acting as the customer's friend and the supplier's friend, as the synchromesh between a huge bureaucratic multi-billion pound ministry and SMEs that just want to sell the best thing at the speed of relevance today.
Okay, we've got some more online questions, and please keep putting the questions in, and we'll do our best to get through them all. Paul Little, who's one of our honorary captains, really wants to to understand the role that you believe innovation and skills are going to make to enhance our strategic deterrent to the king's enemies. I don't know if he's talking specifically about SSBNs. I suspect not. Strategic in the broader sense.
So skills are everything. Every game of chess starts off with two identically powerful sides, and the more skillful side always wins. So in order to ensure that we have the right skills in industry, in the Navy, in the Marines, in our civil service, in our auxiliary workforce, we have to recognise that the skills that we have trained for decades are not necessarily the skills we'll need in the next 10 years. We're not going to throw away the baby with the bathwater. There are numerous things that we've trained for centuries that are fit for purpose. The ethos, the leadership, the discipline. But there are other areas, and I'm sure Jude said this in detail when she spoke to you a few weeks ago, where we recognise that actually Generation Z, Generation Alpha coming through school now have very different expectations on how they learn, how they get treated, how you get trained, and what your job will be. And I think we're making huge strides in ensuring that those people are trained at institutions up and down the country, including Paul's own institution, to make sure that they're fit for purpose on day one, not recruited to join the Navy and then have another 3-year course to be useful.
Okay. Let's go to the next question, which is really one about the moral questions that this raises. Huge amount of talk about AI at the moment, and that's raising right across society all sorts of implications. But in warfare, when you link AI and autonomy, can you foresee a time when British autonomous weapons directed by AI would bring violence to our enemies without a human holding the trigger? Is that the direction of travel for this?
Not for the United Kingdom. The government's made very clear that the decision to take human life, which is the most serious decision a state can take, will always be under the control of a human being operating under the law of armed conflict. The question gets slightly different if you think about timing. So, for example, if a decision has been taken in a targeting board to strike an enemy target, but the time of flight of the weapon that is doing that is measured in hours, there has been a time delay between the person making the decision and the autonomous vehicle, we call them weapons in old speak, that has conducted that decision. And some people are uncomfortable with the fact that we're using that precedent as being an excuse to apply a different ethical framework in the future. It's been very clear to me throughout the guidance I've had, the legal direction in which I operate is crystal clear, that if there is any danger of human life, either as collateral damage or if there's a specific decision to do so, it will not be done by artificial intelligence, it'll be done by human intelligence.
I mean, there was a very powerful film a few years ago, I think called The Eye in the Sky, which just, looked at how that worked. And I mean, that film was probably 10 years ago. And even then, there was just a huge delay in decision-making, coming from London through to somebody sitting in a container driving, in effect, a drone or an autonomous weapon. I mean, if the arms race that you're talking about is real and underway, doesn't that stance, however, morally strong that might be, tie the UK one arm behind our back? Because AI, unrestrained, presumably would provide an advantage to our enemies. And if we are always waiting for a human intervention, which is never going to be as fast as presumably AI's ability to direct an autonomous weapon, it's not going to be a conflict of equals, is it?
It's always been the case. Those who uphold those standards are fighting on the side of justified legality. There have been conflicts in the past, recent conflicts, whereby not adhering to the Geneva Conventions, not adhering to the law of armed conflict, has meant that, yes, it is easier for the enemy to take a friendly life than vice versa. But that does not mean that we should sacrifice our ethical standards for the basis of military convenience. Our job is to find a way around that. Firstly, by deterrence, as I've talked about before, but also by ensuring that the human decisions, should it be needed, are as rapid as they can be, even if it means there is a time delay between what is happening on one side and what is happening in the minds of the enemy, who have far lower ethical standards than us.
I mean, is there a case, and I think this was touched on at the conference this week, a case for some form of international treaty or understanding about how some of these technologies are going to be used? I mean, is that even a possibility, or does it just take the good actors to take a lead unilaterally, or could we try and reach a place where there is some global commitment?
I mean, there's always a danger of this turning into an episode of the moral maze, of which the answer is always it depends. In that conversation that we had this week, the question was actually about arms control, and actually it's not a bad start to what a modern 21st century arms control regime would look like, which is ensuring that the ethical standards we apply to human beings are applicable to machines as well, which would solve that dilemma. I don't see some of the people who would need to sign it up in order for it to be enforceable showing any sign of doing so. But it may well be that things change. The tension may reduce, and it is in periods of non-fighting tension that some of the arms control regimes are put in place to protect us. And I'm optimistic that perhaps that could be something to explore, absolutely.
Right. As I say, please keep your questions coming. I know we also have one or two people joining in from the United States. So if you've got an international question or perspective, I'm sure the Admiral would be up for that. I mean, let's just think about the next steps for the UK. I mean, there is certainly the possibility of another defence review. They come around like buses these days, but there is some talk, depending on political outcomes later this year, which I know you don't want to talk about and shouldn't talk about. But if there is, when it comes, another integrated review or SDSR, what emphasis should that review give to the things that we've been talking about today? And how do you think that will differ from the IR refresh that we had last year?
I think I'm right in saying that both parties likely to form the next government have said there'll be some sort of review. So I think we're on safe ground. Okay. Of course, the nature, the scope is to be defined on both sides. So we're uncertain on what the remit will be. The big reviews are the periodic ones, the quinquennial ones, 10, 15, 21, and then the next one, 25 or 26. And then they're often punctuated by reviews that in some ways are more cerebral because they're not coincident with a fiscal event. The National Security Capability Review in 2017, almost forgotten now, was something I reread recently. Incredibly impressive in terms of the foresight that it brought to the IR in 21. And I wonder if the DCPR, the Defence Command Paper refresh that happened a year and a bit ago, actually will be seen with hindsight as a really useful starting point for the discussions that you're talking about. The capabilities that we've been discussing are now part of modern warfare. The Australian Defence and Security Review have made commitments to a mixed fleet of crewed, optionally crewed, and uncrewed vessels. Our development thinking and our R&D is going exactly the same way. Same with the underwater space, same with the airspace. And we're already far advanced beyond just thinking about it. We have uncrewed air vehicles at sea now. The Peregrine system is deploying in weeks few as the first from the ground up helicopter we've built without a human being on board. And many other examples exist of vessels that we're experimenting, and if they fail, they fail. But if they succeed, they form the template for how we might bring them into service. The MOD knows that, the capability team knows that, and I'm certain the new National Security Advisor knows that too. And after all, it'll be his review, and he was sitting here a couple of weeks ago.
We'll get him back in.
Yeah.
Got a question actually from Mike Beardle, talking about technology, but people, as you've said, are still vital. You've talked about some of the sort of generational changes in the Navy. I mean, how is this technological change going to impact RN personnel in future? Because presumably when you joined, much of this was unimaginable. I mean, even people joining now imagine they're going to go to sea in aircraft carriers and that type of thing. Are people signing up to sit in front of computer screens doing AI, cyber, and directing autonomous assets?
So yes, there will be people doing that, but there'll also be people on bridges of ships. There'll be people physically repairing things. There'll be people doing analysis of data, and there'll be people doing what sailors and Marines have always done, which is working together with the technology available to ensure that British interests are met. When I joined the Navy, we used to train our sailors up to use the technology we have on ships. There is a certain degree, and now people joining the Navy, we have to train them down to use a technology that's not advanced as much as what they see every day. We're reflecting on that now with what a combat management system looks like, what a ship control system on the bridge of a ship looks like. And by adjusting it to ensure that it looks like what they're used to, we're going to keep up with the expectations of the people we recruit. Jude often asks me the question, how many people in a mixed crewed and uncrewed Navy? And we don't know. But what we do know is that for the same number of human beings, with perhaps slightly different skill sets for those from whom I joined the population with, we can control and employ a lot more pieces of equipment, a lot more weapons, a lot more effect. So it's not that the Navy is going to cease being a profession of people. It's more that those people will have a lot more effect because their impact will be multiplied by what we're bringing to service and what we can apply in pursuit of our aims.
Okay. We've got a question here about the Red Sea. So the question essentially is, we're combating hostile actions from the Houthis with multi-million pound missiles from multi-million pound warships. Is that sustainable?
So there's probably two sides to that question. So because there's a factor missing. What were those multi-million pound warships doing? They were protecting multi-trillion pound waterways. The line that was challenged to a senior officer recently about why should you spend £1 million protecting against a £10,000 drone? Well, that was itself being aimed at a £1 billion gas tanker. And no one really looks at the cost of the weapon versus the cost of the impact it would have. A Royal Marine body armour costs £25,000, AK-47 round costs 7p, but no one ever uses it in financial terms. So we shouldn't necessarily consider the cost of the system against the cost of the threat. The real challenge for us, though, is to get at the heart of which I think why it was asked, is it sustainable? Well, no, frankly, it's not. There are better ways of defeating drones than by using multi-million pound weapons. And we should try very hard to introduce them to service as quick as we can. We have a number of programs being accelerated as we speak to ensure that's the case. Some of them are just better guns. Our friends in the French Navy have shot down an awful lot of these Houthi drones with guns. Admittedly, they've come much closer, but that is something that we haven't done except on more than a couple of occasions. So to ensure our stockpiles are safe, ensure that we're not wasting money on things that perhaps didn't have an impact, we've got to find the balance between good old-fashioned gunnery, complex weapons, and the new novel weapons such as Dragonfire, which is being accelerated into service 5 years earlier so it can start to take its place in the lineup of our options.
Further to that, I think one of the questions that was put yesterday at the CPAR conference about the Red Sea, in effect, you've got these actors very cheaply but very effectively providing sort of sea denial, and we have sort of assets trying to combat that. Why was a British aircraft carrier not the right asset to deploy into that theatre to provide, some of the protection that you were talking about? That I think that question was put first yesterday.
It was, and I shall do as best I can to reflect his reply. Whenever a crisis erupts, the government of the day is given options, and the options that they are given include then the consequences of those actions. We have 2 aircraft carriers for a reason. We have fast jets, both 4th, 5th and 6th, and in the future 6th generation jets who can deliver effect. And we have a number of ways in which you can respond to a problem. The decision was taken by the government that the impact on other commitments of deploying the aircraft carrier to that location, when balanced with the fact that the Americans already had an aircraft carrier there, was not, it did not outweigh the risk of not being able to contribute towards NATO's biggest maritime exercise for years. And in the end, Prince of Wales deployed the Steadfast Defender as the largest single contributor of forces in that maritime exercise in order to practice something which we all fear may come to pass, which is high intensity warfare in the North Atlantic. As a sailor, would I have loved to see a British aircraft carrier be at the thick of the action? Yes, I would. It would be protected. The Houthis are not conducting sea denial. There are ships going there every day. There is a contested space, but it's not one that they are winning. But with an American aircraft carrier already there, we don't need to be there for the sake of it when we're working with our friends and with the world's best Type 45 destroyer in order to act as a allied and partnered reaction to one problem, as opposed to trying to do a UK-only solution, which is what in danger it could have been.
Okay. Got a question here from Stuart Milton. Director Develop, not familiar with that role in the Royal Navy. What does Director Develop actually do? It's a good question.
It's a great question, and it's not a job title that that trips off the tongue. In the defence operating model, we talk about a cycle of activity to bring capabilities into service. You first of all direct. That is the first Sea Lord's job. You then develop that capability. It is then acquired, and it is then brought into service, at which point it's generated. And when it's generated, it's then operated. So in terms of direct, develop, acquire, generate, operate, originally in the defence model when applied to the Navy, every one of those functions had a director. And I am Director Develop, in charge of developing the Navy after next. But I have a better title. I am the 78th Controller of the Navy, the first one of which appointed in 1668. And that role has a slightly different function, which is to sponsor all the in-service capability to check that what we have in service today is still fit for purpose. And I can close that loop to ensure that we can update it, adjust it, and if necessary, replace it.
Controller Navy, I'll go with that. That sounds great. As a communications person, exactly. I like that. Right, we've got about 10 minutes left. So I've got a question here from Adam Klink, who you may know. It's quite a long question. Let me try and share it with you. The First Sea Lords Conference raised the concept of using the merchant fleet to augment our warships. What's your view on how far that concept could develop, including the potential deployment of lethal expeditionary capabilities connected to the network to increase combat mass? It's a bit more. Too complex from a legal, ethical, and C2 perspective. I explain what C2 is. Or a viable way of presenting a broadly dispersed offensive posture should the national need demand it. So,
it's a great question, and one that I'm sure, Clinky, there's a book in it somewhere. Right. So one of the legal powers that His Majesty's government does is to requisition ships, aircraft, boats. In most cases, we don't use those powers. We take them up from trade. We hire them, charter them, either bare bones or with their crews. Last done en masse in 1982, but actually to a degree, for logistics reasons, done in the First and Second Gulf Wars as well. In those era, we didn't use them to deploy weapon systems from. There are very good reasons why merchant ships have a different legal status in the law of armed conflict. And if you are a non-combatant, you are protected from certain attacks from the enemy. And if you're a combatant, you are not. Hospital ships, as you may recall, have a different status again. And under the law that's grown up over centuries, Hague Convention, Geneva Conventions, law of armed conflict, you see a degree of demarcation between a civilian vessel being used on government service and a combatant. If we were to deploy lethal effect from those vessels, we would be stripping them of the protection they enjoy as civilian vessels. And in many cases, we would be unable to ensure that the ship's company and crews of those vessels would be employed. They would have the right to not be on board. So we've got to be really careful. Now, in some cases, that might be absolutely appropriate. We may be able to use the vessels, but it's not something that's in my planning as a option for increasing the mass of the fleet in a combatant way. It is absolutely at the heart of our potential thinking about increasing our logistics footprint. We wouldn't necessarily use any of the vessels. We have the strategic ro-ro ferries already. We regularly charter ships under normal marine chartering rules to take equipment from A to B and sometimes to conduct exercises and training. But the second they're combatants, it's a very different conversation. And I think the question that we are unable to answer, and it is also included in your question, Adam, is what happens if you put if you put a sensor on there? So does using a radar picture from a merchant ship turn it into a combatant? I'm not sure it does, but I'm not a lawyer and it's not one that I've explored carefully, and it's probably one we should look into.
Adam, thank you very much. I've got a question from Ben Russell about how are we advancing all of this with our allies, especially in NATO? And are we sharing the innovation and the ideas? And is that reciprocal?
It absolutely is. And there's a number of frameworks in which we have an ability to share ideas, technology, and in many cases, equipment. I'll talk about NATO first. So there is an exercise once a year in Portugal called RETMUS. RETMUS, based south of Lisbon, often dual-hatted with a NATO exercise. And the idea for that series of training is you move from interoperability, i.e. you can play with each other's equipment, to interchangeability, i.e. any NATO nation can effectively operate another NATO nation's equipment as if it is their own. It's been the case for years with ammunition and fuel and certain other commodities. But by the RETMUS series of exercises, we are building together a standard. It's called a STANAG in the vernacular. Really, really important, not particularly exciting because it's detailed technical documentation. But it's the same sort of technical documentation that means that a British ship can take fuel from a Turkish tanker, or a American helicopter can refuel from a Greek ship, because the standards are the same.
But where are we with the sort of high-end tech? So, ITAR has been, has existed for understandable reasons, protects US innovation, limit to how much is shared. But we now live in circles of alliances from AUKUS and Five Eyes and NATO. Where does the UK sit within that ecosystem? And are we both the beneficiary and the sharer of future treasure?
We absolutely are, because we benefit from setting the standards. We lead on the NATO standard for the interoperability of autonomous systems. Huge kudos to the United Kingdom and the team of experts and scientists working for me, for DSTL, for UK Strategic Command, who are forcing that through. But equally, in the AUKUS umbrella, under Pillar 2 of AUKUS, there are numerous examples where British technology has been at the forefront of working with Australian and American technology to deliver something that is, in some cases, in the hand of the warfighter, and in many others will be soon. But I've got bilateral relationships with our friends in the Republic of Korea, where they're working on unique technology on battery storage that we can learn from. Equally, we have British companies embedding themselves in Japanese shipbuilding competitions, because there is British tech at the heart of the Japanese company that's bidding in for a Japanese program. We couldn't do that without the dull but necessary treaty signing, agreement writing, statement of intent crafting, which, although at the time seems quite dry, it unlocks me going to a company in Portugal or Denmark or Chile or Greece, and being able to talk to them legally, practically and commercially about what technology they have for us and what we can share with them.
Okay. I mean, we need to draw this to a close in a moment. If you've got any last minute questions, get them in now. I just want to come back to people. I mean, we're doing this tonight, on behalf of the Royal Navy, Royal Marines charity. You and I served as trustees in the charity. Actually, we had some very productive and highly entertaining meetings, which help. I hope, and at the time, help the charity with its direction. I mean, what role do you think do the service charities really play in supporting not only the serving community but also, of course, veterans and their families? I mean, is the need? You're sitting here in uniform from inside the service as great as it's ever been, or is there a watch out for the charities in terms of where they should be focusing their efforts and work?
I think there is always unmet need. The beneficiaries that charities such as RNRMC look towards are different from the beneficiaries of other naval charities. We have a number of charities in the naval family of maritime charities in particular, which focus in on particular use cases, and they are experts in that field. Others, such as RNRMC, focus on as many people as possible, including the serving community. And other charities, again, focus entirely on veterans. Within those horizontally, you have mental health needs. We have those in particular geographical areas, or those in particular ranks or branches of the service. But whatever those charities focus on, they have one thing in common, which is an absolutely passionate need to understand what our beneficiaries are lacking and the way in which we can provide that for them. I think one of the things I remember most about my 9 years on the board of the RNRMC, was trying to work out where the balance lies between where the government should step in, where it should be the job of the Royal Navy to support this as opposed to the job of the RNRMC. I think we've got that balance about right. There's always going to be things that...
I mean, I always remember we had debates in some of the trustee meetings about an ask to, fund, a decaying, refurbish a decaying building or whatever, that frankly should absolutely sit with Defence and the Treasury. Why a charity should be doing that.
And I think they were few and far between. I remember one example about funding a physio deploying on an operational deployment, because there were no physios available in the armed forces to go. But by funding that physio, what we did was, I think it was something like 400 members of that task group did not have to fly back to the UK for treatment. They could be returned to frontline duty. And actually, although that should have absolutely been the Ministry of Defence's job to do, there physically wasn't someone that they had available to do it. And the objects of the charity to support the fighting effectiveness of the fleet, which is in the RNRMC objects, was met in a way that I don't think anyone envisaged when they did it. The best thing about that story is the next time the deployment came around, the MOD said, "You're absolutely right, you've proven why we should do that, and we've never been asked for it again."
Well, thank you. And I mean, again, I mean, everybody watching, I think, knows a lot about the charity and the work of the charity. And we have things like the Nelson's Company, ways of pledging support and whatever. And I 100% urge everybody to do what they can. It's an incredible organisation and really worthwhile.
It really is. And I'm as a former trustee, but also as a beneficiary myself by being in service, I know how much the wider fleet recognises and grateful for the RNRMC's work in particular, but also the way in which the wider maritime charity sector, which could work slightly closer together, are meeting the needs of our people, our men, our women, our sailors, marines, auxiliary, civilians, and their families, and the retired community. And it's hugely wonderful to see the impact that the money from Nelson's Company and other places are making towards those needs.
Can I just end by asking, really a sense of how you feel right now about the work that you do? And if we talked a bit about the 30-year view, and I graduated in late 80s, and I remember being in Berlin as the wall came down. And at that time, the UK was spending 4% of GDP on defence, and it had been much higher in the Cold War. And then we've had these decades in which you've spent most of your professional career serving, where, apart from moments of conflict and international crisis, essentially, as a nation, we've just got used to not really needing to worry too much about defence or spend too much about defence. We're now obviously in a completely different place where, talk in the pub is about the size of our armed forces. There is a national debate about, and maybe even now something of a consensus across the political divide, around the need to invest in defence and our armed forces. Do you and the other admirals sit there thinking about bloody time, or what is the sentiment that goes through your mind as this national mood begins to shift and change?
I don't think there's consensus about our collective feelings, but I think it's worth reflecting on what the peace dividend bought us. After the Cold War, we diverted tens, hundreds of billions from the defence budget into making the United Kingdom a safer, more equal, happier place. With retrospect, it would have been nonsensical to keep armed forces of the size of the Cold War at a period where we were not under threat. And it was entirely appropriate for the government of the day to say, tripling the expenditure on the NHS is exactly the right thing to do. Reinvesting in education and social care is a legitimate use of taxpayers' money when we don't feel that we need to invest in the armed forces. But like all things, there has to be an ability to revisit past decisions. And I think my personal feelings are, we have now, in time, just recognised that eventually you're going to have to upgrade your third-party insurance policy to a fully comprehensive insurance policy. Premiums are really expensive, and I'm not pretending that the insurance premium that is a Royal Navy is cheap. But what it is incredibly worthwhile, because the thing that's really expensive is making a claim. And it is far better to have armed forces that are capable, that are crewed and staffed with the best possible people in the country, and are funded to an ability that can deter the king's enemies, than it would be to retrospectively say we should have done that in 2024. I'm sorry, we have now lost the next war. You've told me that in your very first question, is the Royal Navy able to take part in winning the next war? And the answer is yes. And my job is to make sure that's the case. And that's both exciting and daunting, but it's a fight that I'm up for, and it's a fight that I'm loving being involved in.
James, thank you very much. We're out of time, but that's been a great discussion.
Thank
you very much. Thank you very much for watching, everybody. Hope you'll join us again next time. All best.